So, welcome to Mind Matter CogSci Talks, the podcast where we kind of explore the fascinating world of cognitive science through conversations with researchers and scholars helping us by better understand the human mind. So, today I'm excited to welcome Arvid, a PhD candidate in developmental psychology at Cornell University, where he works in the Developmental Psychology Lab. So his research kind of explores like moral development and social cognition with a particular focus on how, children and adults understand like the idea of moral disagreement. And his work kind of asks thought-provoking questions about how we make sense of different perspectives and how important it is to understand them and why two reasonable people can disagree, even though none of them are unreasonable, and understanding how morality develops throughout our lives and our experiences. So thank you so much for joining us today. It's a pleasure to have you on Mind Matter CogSci Talks. So I guess
Yeah,
before we dive deeper into your research, could you tell us a little bit more about yourself and what first got you interested into like the broader picture of just psychology as a bigger major and kind of understanding how people think?
yeah. Well, I mean, first of all, thanks for that lovely intro. It's fun to hear yourself described in that way. I guess what first got me interested in psychology, I feel like probably some combination of kind of like always being somewhat introverted. I moved a lot as a kid. Kind of like I've lived. I counted at one point, and I think I've made kind of like seven major moves in my life. And so I think I got to see a lot of different people, got to kind of be in a lot of different areas and cultures and communities. And so I was always kind of just interested in people watching. I'll still do that constantly during my day to day. Um, and so I think it was always something that was kind of like an option, that something that I would thought I'd be interested in. And then I felt like, I took a few classes. I took a few philosophy classes, kind of hovered around the topic. And I think I just ended up feeling like it was something that I could go home and be happy thinking about. And that for me was the sign that like, yeah, this is an area that like I really enjoy being in.
Was there like a specific project or a moment, or like when did you kind of discover like what time in your life, maybe in like high school or like undergrad is like maybe like when did you kind of discover your interest for this?
It's a good question. I mean, the first psychology class I took was in high school. I don't know if I took it and was immediately like, "Oh, this is everything I want to do." It was fun though. I think it was actually in undergrad when I started working in research in a psychology research lab that I realized that it was kind of the right blend of liberal arts, philosophy, critical thinking, as well as that kind of like scientific rigor that I really appreciated. So probably yeah, right around like maybe sophomore year, freshman year of undergrad, something like that.
Yeah. So I saw your current work mainly focuses on like moral development and social cognition. So I guess that's probably like a smaller sector of psychology. So for people who might not know or is like as familiar with that field, what do you guys actually study and what kind of drew you to specifically that in psychology?
Yeah, it's a good question. I think terminology is always so I don't know, sometimes it doesn't, it just kind of feels like just a label for something, but both of those terms can just kind of be easily broken up. So moral development is part of this larger branch of what's called developmental psychology. And you can think of developmental psychology as being interested in studying the change of behavior or emotions or people, just kind of anything that changes. You can study that across, like a common one is time and age, there's like longitudinal studies. But you can also study it across situations. That's something that's changing. So how do people act in one situation from another? You can study across history as well. And so when you add moral to that equation, you're just studying the change of moral functioning, moral judgments, moral decisions. Me personally, I mostly focus on that kind of like situational and change within a lifespan. And then social cognition, that's also another part of a bigger school of psychology called cognitive psychology. And the people who study cognitive psychology are just really interested in understanding how people think, from everything from like the really kind of like very close detail level, kind of like going to like a very like basic level of like how does attention work in the brain, to like more kind of like abstract concepts of thinking, which is usually kind of where I exist. And so social cognition kind of mixes cognitive psychology with this aspect of other people around us because we're social creatures, we live in a social world. How do other people affect our thinking? How do we think about other people? Those are the main kind of questions that would steer that. And so, because I study moral psychology or moral development, it's very easy to make that social in nature because morality is this kind of inherently social thing. So hopefully that gives a little better picture of kind of like where the field's at.
Yeah. So I guess as you're doing research right now, has there been any like surprising findings from your research that kind of changed the way how you think about other people or how you think about your own behavior and like how it's shaped by maybe like your childhood experiences or just like experiences growing up?
Hmm. That's an interesting question. I mean, surprising. I think there's constantly research that I read by other people that I find really surprising, mostly because it's something that I haven't really thought about yet, or they have this kind of very interesting
Mm.
analysis on kind of what's going on. I think when it comes to my own research, though, I'm not saying that like I know what's going to happen, but it's just that you spend so long planning these studies out, kind of reading the literature, that it feels like you have a pretty good expectation, or you can make a pretty good prediction. I think the most fun, most like kind of like surprises that you get are when things don't pan out. So let's say you set up an experiment, you think you're doing something, you think you're getting at something that people are experiencing, and you realize you're completely off. And so I think that's surprising. Either there could be a million reasons for why that happens, but those are the times when I'm kind of like, oh, I didn't expect to see that people don't care about this, or there's no differences here, and that happens a bunch of times. But yeah, that's probably my answer.
Yeah. So I guess still on the topic of research and
Mhm.
like a lot of people are doing research too. So I guess like what are some limitations that you guys have or like do you think is that I don't know, people in this research field are kind of facing right now?
Some challenges. Well, so I guess like a kind of like a perennial challenge with psychology is that if you compare it to another branch of science, like let's just pick physics because it's like a pretty classical one, they're able to study like the phenomenon that they're interested in, kind of like directly at the phenomenon. People who work with electricity or some kind of, quantum mechanics, like they can kind of really get to the thing that they're interested in. Me though, like I'm interested in morality. And it's like I can't just go and point to somewhere in the person and say, well, there it is, that's morality, and I can see it. So we're always kind of working with these very complex systems and experiences, so you're having to kind of like abstract away from that phenomenon. And every abstraction means that it's like a little messier. There's
Mm.
this idea of separating signal from noise in research. And so what you want is signal, right? You want to be able to tell why things are happening, what's going on, and noise is just kind of random change. And so I think you can imagine, let's say, you go through your day, and if you just imagine how often your kind of mood just changes, and the reasons for your mood changing throughout the day could be endless, right? It could just be like it's a little too warm in the room currently, and that might have nothing to do with, say, the research that I'm interested in doing. So I think that's kind of like always a challenge of psychologists is that we're dealing in like quite abstract terms. That's actually a really big reason for why I really enjoy it is because we're in kind of like a very gray area. Things are like kind of hard to pin down. But it's really, really satisfying when you can like make a good case that you've like isolated this really interesting thing.
Yeah. I mean, I definitely think moral psychology is a very abstract topic considering that like when you grow up, like everyone has different viewpoints of like what being moral is, right?
Mhm.
So I guess that kind of leads us into our next topic of a lot of people assume that if like two people disagree on something moral, like one of them has to be wrong, or maybe both of them are a little wrong. So why is it kind of important to study how people see others as reasonable and like even when they disagree, and how is it kind of like shaped by their experiences, and why is like
Mhm.
moral like being moral so like abstract?
Yeah, that's a good question. I think so. I guess so. My initial interest in this idea of seeing somebody else as reasonable um, came from this like realization that or this like belief that I have that people usually do things and believe things for what they think are like good reasons, right? It's like it's kind of like hard. It's rare that you meet someone and you ask them like, "Why do you believe this?" And they say, "Well, because I think it's the wrong thing to believe." So that would just be like counterintuitive. Uh, and so I guess that there's kind of this clarification that you can make where you could see somebody else as completely wrong and still completely reasonable. Because in how I kind of define this idea of reasonableness is you're evaluating the steps that that person took to reach the belief that they have. And so if they've taken steps that seem sensible given their inputs, given their experiences, then that's a reasonable person, even if they're completely wrong. I think that like as a non-moral example, you could go back to like the people who used to believe these like old astronomers who used to believe in like this geocentric model of the universe, like Earth was at the center of the universe, everything
Yeah.
orbited around the Earth, and those people, not a moral issue, but completely reasonable given the evidence that they had, right? Like they weren't crazy or like they was wrong at the end of the day, but you'd be surprised to say that, or I'd be shocked to hear somebody say, oh, those are completely unreasonable people. Um, and so why, kind of trying to answer your question fully, why that's important to study in disagreements, I suppose. Um, as moral psychologists, we can't really prove that somebody in a moral argument is right or wrong, right? Like that's not what
Yeah.
we do. We're not philosophers. We'd be really bad philosophers if we tried to be. But what we can do is study kind of these attributions that people are making of others. And so it's kind of my belief that when you see other people as reasonable, if you agree or you disagree with them, that's going to lead you to act really differently toward them than if you saw that person as unreasonable. Um, yeah, and I think one of the reasons I was interested in it is because it is kind of a rare thing, or it's kind of hard to do so. There's a lot of good evidence that there are these kinds of forces, both within ourselves and without ourselves, or outside of ourselves, that want us to see those people who disagree as unreasonable people. And so those are the kind of like the reasons that I'm interested in this. Hopefully that answered your question.
Yeah, yeah, that's good. So I feel like, especially nowadays, I feel like a lot of people don't understand like what I feel like we just talked about, how like you guys can't disagree and both be moral people. And like especially online, there's a lot of controversy, just like in general. So do you think your research kind of offers any insight into why disagreements have become so polarized, and like how can we kind of fix this so like we can just have healthier conversations in general? Like maybe not
Mhm.
always view the other person as just like not moral or something like that.
Yeah, yeah. Yeah, absolutely. I mean, there's also a bunch of people who are, of course, like psychologists who are really interested in exactly this question. And so there's a bunch of really interesting research being done right now about social media, moral disagreements, kind of how these things interact. Um, I think where my research comes in is that one of the big findings we have, or when I say big findings, I just mean kind of like the finding that we often, discover however we implement it or whatever we're changing, um, is this idea of uh, seeing an issue as difficult makes you more likely to see those who disagree with you as reasonable. And it's this idea of appreciating a multifaceted kind of nature to these issues, which opens up the possibility that somebody could have disagreed with you in a way that is nonetheless reasonable. So to give it an easy kind of example from work that we've done, we've asked people these like really simple moral dilemmas. This is kind of where this all started was we asked people a dilemma where someone went up and hit somebody else. Just no reason given, just they just went and hit them. Completely just like a moral transgression. And so in those cases, nobody finds really disagreement to be reasonable there because there's no, you can't really defend the opposite decision in a way that seems to make sense. But if you change that simple scenario and you just add the fact that this is a retaliation, let's say that this person hits person A hits person B hits person A back. In that case, in this kind of like retaliatory case, people find disagreement to be more reasonable. And so what we're doing there really simply is we're saying we're just making the problem a little bit more complex, right? Just kind of adding a degree of complexity there. And so when you scale this up to these kinds of modern day contemporary political and moral issues that we have, we still find that the people who rate these issues as more difficult see those people who disagree with them as more reasonable. And I think that connects to the kind of social media landscape where oftentimes where we talk about these issues completely kind of like collapses these grays and nuances that exist in a lot of these issues. I think that's kind of like mostly where I see my work connecting.
Yeah, I think it definitely makes sense that like a more difficult situation in general makes you kind of see others as more moral. Because I feel like in that case, it's so hard to define what moral is. And if you are an outsider, you don't know a lot of like why people do, like in this scenario, you said like of two people slapping each other, you don't know like any motives behind that. Or like I feel like sometimes it makes sense on both viewpoints of like what has happened. So I guess like now moving on to like the next topic of like children and experiences. So do you think children and adults approach moral disagreement differently? I mean, I feel like a lot of the times people believe that adults are more moral and children are learning from these people and their morals are kind of developed from, I don't know, maybe their parents or like the adults that they're surrounded by. So I guess are there any possible like misconceptions or just like discoveries in general that people kind of have about how kids develop their sense of right and wrong?
Mm. Yeah, and there's a lot of interesting ways to discuss that question. I guess one of the things you said is actually tapping into this kind of really contemporary debate that we have, like theoretical debate, specifically when you said that kids are like kind of like learning from their parents. And I think there's this idea that kids are being kind of like shaped by their parents. Often when, because we do studies with kids, often the parents might come to us and say, how do I make my kid more moral? Like, how do I get them to follow the rules? How do I get them to kind of adopt my own beliefs? And I think that is a misconception because there's a lot of very good research that shows that moral development isn't just this adopting, this kind of like learning process. To kind of really develop one's own morality, kids are actively constructing their morality. So yeah, they're absolutely taking in those signals that parents are saying, right? But they're not just taking in that and not doing anything with it. I'm sure you might be able to imagine some times where you've disagreed with your parents about where the line stand, like kind of like where the line should be drawn. And so what we see is that really giving kids, if you want your kid to be more moral, whatever that is, we don't really pick an end point for morality, but really it's about engaging in this kind of moral thinking. And so that's that kind of like cognition that's required to be able to deal with these hard problems. It takes practice, it takes time handling these nuances. On that topic, I'd say if you compared kids and adults, um, one of the reasons that so in my studies, I don't think I've gone younger than 14 years old. And my kind of reason for that is that kind of going back to this idea of reasonableness, to see someone else as reasonable, you first need to understand the issue that you're dealing with, but then you need to get into that person's mind and be able to simulate how they reached their belief that they ended up reaching, right? And that seems easy to us as people who can do so, but at some point, kids are not able to do that, right? They just cannot understand that at all. And so there's a kind of a cognitive development that's required to even be able to make this attribution of reasonableness. And so if you went as low as, I don't know, maybe I'd be interested actually to run a study on kind of like when this first appears.
Yeah.
But I'd be really surprised to see kind of like a 5-year-old being able to grasp this idea of reasonableness. And that's not to say that they kind of hate disagreements, but it's just this idea that that cognition isn't something that they're fully capable yet of doing. And of course, not all adults are maybe willing to do so. But I think that they have those kind of cognitive capabilities that you need to be able to kind of make this assumption about others.
It makes sense that you guys don't go about studying about stuff like this. I feel like when they're, I don't know, like really young, like 8 years old, I'm sure they probably don't have their own sense or they don't really understand life, I feel like. And I feel like as they grow older, like maybe their parents or like school, like they'll instill like these ideas of like, oh, you need to grow up, you need to like actually learn, or you need to do this, you need to do that. So as they grow older, they obviously have like more of a sense of who they are and like what they want to do and like what like their goals kind of in life. So I guess that kind of makes sense. But so I feel like when you get older, right, I feel like they kind of take the like the adult sense of a moral and they kind of like evaluate themselves and kind of see how they view it and then they do it.
Mhm.
So I feel like not always like the parents' morals reflect upon their kids. I feel like a lot of the times the kids will reflect it themselves and see like how it works. Because I feel like nowadays, like a lot of things are changing. Like what parents believe, like what they believe back in the day might not apply like nowadays. So I
Mhm.
guess we can kind of transition into the idea of AI since it's such a popular topic nowadays. And like a lot of
Mhm.
people want to study it, and it's also like really concerning because of like ethical concerns and a lot of other concerns. So I guess like as AI becomes better at making decisions and kind of interacting with people, do you think understanding like human morality is even more important when like developing these AIs? And are there any lessons that like maybe from like developmental psychology that kind of AI researchers should pay more attention to?
That's a good question. I guess the only like real connection that I've heard people make is mostly people being worried that they're going to have some AI large language model in charge of making decisions that are morally relevant, right? Healthcare decisions or decisions involving like self-driving cars, right? Like there's the classic, like say that you're driving down the road and it has to hit one of two people. Like it doesn't have time to swerve out of the way. How does it decide which of those people? And so a lot of people are worried because that means that somebody at some point has to decide what's morally right in that scenario. And the thing about morality is that, as you pointed out in the last question, that's constantly changing, right? Like if you compare morality from even 20 years ago, 50 years ago, it looks different to what it looks like now. Um, but that's I don't know if I haven't heard of people kind of seriously taking up that decision. I'm sure what the AI researchers could learn from us. I think it's interesting that there's a good amount of work, psychological work, that shows that um, in some circumstances, people actually prefer an AI to a human. This is like kind of really prevalent when you're talking about getting accurate information, having disagreements about like conspiracy theories. So, imagine that you're talking to someone who believes in like the flat Earth theory. That person is much more likely to be convinced by an AI than they are by you. Because people kind of tend to see others as inherently flawed and biased, but they don't do so for AIs because they're seen as this kind of like pure like
Mhm.
transportation of information. Um, so yeah, I don't know. It's absolutely a developing topic. I think I haven't thought about it too much just because I think I spend most of my time trying to bury my head in the sand when the AI kind of tsunami is coming in, and I'm mostly thinking about people. But I'm sure that at some point we're going to run into those problems of like AIs having to make a decision that really has some moral consequence. Yeah, we'll see where it goes.
Well, yeah, I think it's definitely true because I know like for me, I'm kind of looking more into like how people make decisions. So there's like this one study I saw where they looked at like synthetic faces versus real faces, and then you have like AI versus humans telling you whether
Mm.
it's real or not. But in the end, like I think they repeated this study, and like as like it became more recent, like more people started believing in AI, and even though like AI would be like this, it would have the same accuracy as humans. So I think
Do you know
that's
who
definitely hmm?
do you know who did that?
I'm
Do you
not
know who the
sure,
authors
but
were?
I read a
Hmm.
paper on it.
Yeah, I'd be interested. Okay, cool. Yeah, yeah. It
Yeah,
sounds like a fun
but
study. It reminds me of a study that I think a friend ran, but I think they
oh,
did it a bit
really?
differently.
Oh, that's really cool. But yeah, it's kind of shows that like people are starting to trust AI more just because it's AI and it should be more like reliable. So
Hmm.
hopefully in the future, like it doesn't really take over that much because I think definitely compared to a human, like I mean, unless AI is trained really well, which is kind of like more of an ethical concern, I feel. So I feel like maybe it will be an issue in the future. So I guess for students who are kind of thinking about pursuing psychology or developmental science, or maybe like I know Cornell offers like a moral psychology or like a developmental psychology minor. What kind of skills or experiences do you think are most valuable before graduate school or maybe even before college, like before kind of deciding what you want to do? Yeah.
Hmm. It's a good question. I think it's a moral psychology minor because we have such a
Mhm.
roster of moral psychologists at Cornell, which is sweet as a Cornell's PhD student. Just so many pretty interesting and smart people. But onto the main question about what kind of skills to develop. It's hard. I mean, I would, by the way, completely recommend that people get involved in psychology and developmental science. I feel like it's a fascinating group to be a part of. I really enjoy it, so come join us. We need more smart people. But the kinds of skills, I feel like for me, what separates um, some like the kind of like really kind of like great students in my mind are the ones that have spent a lot of time thinking about what kind of human aspect they're interested in studying. So like really
Mm,
deeply thinking about, for me, it's like morality, moral functioning. How do people develop this? But I have so many, interesting and talented friends that are really serious thinkers about their area of work. And
mm,
so it's that kind of idea of like, you should want to be doing this even when nobody is watching, because
mm.
the life of a researcher oftentimes is that nobody's really watching. And so I don't have to don't want to say that, to be a PhD student, you have to think that this is your life goal, but I do think that having a genuine interest in whatever you're doing is going to make you much, much more successful if you end up doing that. You could go to the best major on paper according to a bunch of bricks, but if you don't like doing that, if you don't like doing the work, if you're not interested in it, you're not going to want to do it. Um, in terms of hard skills, though, I mean, you could talk about reading and writing. Those are probably the two kind of cornerstones of the PhD in psychology. I've read more and written more than I think I ever have, and maybe ever will. But yeah, I do think that like at the end of the day, I do think though that enjoyment, that motivation really shines through when I'm like talking to some people, and that is kind of what makes them these like amazing candidates that you want to work with.
Yeah, that definitely makes sense because I know like on another episode, I talked to some girl who was studying like lucid dreaming because she figured
Mm.
like she did a lot of lucid dreaming, which is I feel like such a cool topic that no one really kind
Mhm.
of explores because it's like you kind of have to create, or she kind of like created like the research by herself. Like she was like, okay, I'm interested in this. Like, what can I do with this? Instead of just like
Mhm.
looking at labs being like, oh, which one like fits my major the most or which one I don't know like which one will help me the most in the future. So I think that's
Yeah.
definitely interesting. So I guess it's also on the topic of like hard skills that you're talking about of like reading and writing with like the increase of AI. Like I've seen all over like the news that like students and their like reading and writing scores and just like technical skills in general are not great right now. So what are your thoughts on that, and do you think that's kind of an issue?
Oof, well, I mean, I think one explanation that is not as pessimistic would be that we've gotten really good at reading and writing, just kind of broad trends. So the fact that our reading and writing scores are not increasing might, you could argue it's not a result of AI necessarily. It might just be the result of kind of like a ceiling effect, right? Like a kind of a, we've gotten really close. You can look at this in other areas of human functioning too, where I think the 100-meter marathon, 100-meter sprint time is like a great example of this, right? Like we can't really get much faster, like not a whole lot. And so maybe that's the case with reading and writing too. But I do think, though, that personally, I don't know if there's a good amount of evidence on this, but I am wary of some of the ways that AI can influence
Mm,
our kind of how much effort we put into things. Unfortunately, at the end of the day, I think the older I get, the more experience I get, the more I realize that there's a lot of things in life that simply take effort and time. And when you rob yourself of opportunities to engage in that effort, you don't develop the skills that you will need later on. And so, it's one thing if you're using AI to optimize things that you already know how to do, or to like kind of like deal with little tasks that, you don't really want to be spending the time doing. But I think it's another thing when you're letting it rob you of an opportunity to like struggle and to have to deliberate and to have to kind of like chew with something. That's usually what I try to tell students is like when you run into that wall and when you don't know what to say, what to do, like sit in it for a little bit. Like that is like it's a necessary process. Every day when I'm writing, I get stuck. That's just kind of a part of thinking and practicing thinking. Yeah, and ultimately though, I'm fortunate that I was born, 5, 10 years at like not later than I was, because I'm sure that I would use a bunch of AI if I was a student as well. But I think it in the long run, there's this kind of investment that you're doing in yourself, which I think when I see students who are like really prevailing, they let themselves kind of struggle a little bit with things. I'm so sorry, I don't think I can hear you.
Oh, sorry.
Nice.
But yeah, I was just talking about how I'm looking into like cognitive offloading, which is I think such an important topic of like how much students should be offloading to AI, because AI is good like when you use it to offload like repetitive tasks, but when it gets to like actually deep thinking skills, then I think it's something that they shouldn't do, or they should look in more into farther and kind of consider the concerns that are like surrounding or the problems in the future that it might
Yeah.
like. So I guess
I
that
think
kind
that
of,
Oh,
sorry.
sorry. I think I was gonna go on another tirade about like the times when I least appreciate AI is when it takes away an opportunity at creativity. I think like the classic case, nobody likes to see AI art, but I also think writing is like inherently creative. And so I would kind of, I would take the kind of opportunity to say like, let yourself, put out whatever it is you want to put out. Like make sure it's your opinions, things like that. But yeah, it's a developing topic. It's really hard. It's not easy to handle.
Yeah. Well, I guess that brings us to the end of today's episode of Mind Matter CogSci Talks. So, Arvid, thank you so much for joining me and kind of sharing your research and your insights and what like you kind of think about society and like the ideas of morals. And it was really fascinating to learn more about moral development and what it is, and also social cognition and how we kind of understand different perspectives throughout our lives through our experiences and how it's shaped by the people around us and ourselves. And I especially appreciated learning about your work and how it helps us think more deeply about disagreement, what it actually means, having empathy, and the way and like the ways that we can kind of better understand one another and like view each other as more moral during these, I don't know, like times of disagreement.
Yeah.
So I guess thank you again for taking the time to be here. And I guess until next time, like for the listeners, stay curious, keep asking questions, and thanks for listening. So thank you for being
No,
here.
thank you for having me. I had fun. Thanks so much.
Thank you.